Welcome back, everyone, to a figure-by-figure director's commentary behind-the-scenes look at the Masters of the Universe Classics line. I actually had to go back and look at some of the release lists to make sure I was doing this in the right order, because it was definitely at this point in the line that we had a little bit of some changes, and some of the figures weren't released in the order that they were created in, etc., etc., but I think I got it right that Merman was the figure after Faker. So yeah, Merman, he was awesome. I mean, like, really awesome. In fact, still to this day, I think that Merman is probably one of the top 5, if not top 3, top 1 characters released in the whole line. He kicked butt. And his release was definitely in part to some delays. We had some problems with the way the original 2-packs were either being sculpted or tooled. Honestly, I don't remember the exact details. I do know that the final 2-pack was meant to be Zodak and Man-at-Arms, simply because they reused all the same parts. Merman was going to require some different parts, and they were scheduled to be the next figures, but there were some delays, and that meant Merman was going to get slotted in as the April 2009 figure, which was pretty cool because, honestly, I think he's a little cooler than Zodak. Not that Zodak isn't a great figure, but, Merman was much more prominent in the Filmation series, and he's definitely one of those core Skeletor bad guys that everybody thinks of when they think of Skeletor bad guys. Anyway, before jumping into him, I just want to do a quick talk about the packaging. So, originally, what I wanted to do was release the MOTUC Classics figures on a basically updated version of the vintage card, meaning the red explosion and the asteroids going everywhere and the bubble that was formed kind of like in that triangular shape. And yeah, eventually, actually, I think Super 7 did some of this. Well, what management wanted was to release them in a white box because their thoughts, these figures aren't going to retail at all. There is no reason we need to spend any packaging or packaging design bandwidth or efforts on the package when it's just going right to consumers. And I made kind of the case that, no, we're doing a collector line here. We need to at least do something cool. So management said, fine, you can do something, but you have no budget to do it with. So, looking at what we did have, was the compromise was basically to do this with the green brick, because we had the green brick file from the King Grayskull figure, and we could repurpose that without much design work, and by having the bios and the cross-sell on the back, that took up a lot of real estate, and it meant we could basically do a repurpose. And a repurpose was a much better solution than doing a white box, which I didn't want to do because I felt like that would have just killed the line. It would have been DOA right at the first figure. What's a white box with my He-Man in it? And then, of course, there was the JHooks. If you remember, there were not JHooks on the first couple releases, and I made a big stink about this, that we needed to get JHooks onto the back of the figures. And of course, again, management and packaging was like, why are we doing this? And I got into another big fight because this was another expense, and why do we need JHooks on the figures? Because, again, we're shipping them online directly in the mail to customers. It's not like these figures are going to hang at retail and need the JHooks to do that. But again, my case was that fans are going to want to display them in package, and a JHook is needed in order to post them on the wall, because not everyone has the shelf space. And in the end, I won, but it definitely cost me, and I lost some political capital, which meant I kind of had to pick and choose what battles I was going to fight in the future. But I think this was the right call, and, for what it cost me, getting JHooks and getting at least something that wasn't a white box was a victory. Alright, so back to the line. Stratos was a sellout. I mentioned that last time in a couple of videos ago. That's not a word. And this was a big deal because it meant that we were going to get to look beyond the original 2-packs, which, again, were broken up into singles. And the first thing we did was that we got 2 more slots, and those went to Hornak and to Merman. So they were going to be the next two figures, and that might have also been it if we didn't get more sellouts, but we did. Which meant that things were going to go haywire, because every time there's a change from the original plan, things don't exactly get back on track quickly. But, we did, and eventually we were back on track. And the next figure was, again, going to be one of the best figures in the line. And I think that's a big part because of this. He had two heads. But doing two heads on a figure was not that common back then, back in 2009. I mean, today, most figures at retail for collectors do have multiple heads. In fact, this 80th edition or 80th anniversary of Marvel, Captain America had two heads that the only difference was his facial expression. And, that's really cool. But back in 2009, doing more than one head for a figure had to have kind of a lot of justification, especially when it came down to the tooling budget, because heads wound up having a lot more deco on them than any other part, so that was going to affect the total cost of the figure. So if we were going to do two heads, there had to be, shall we say, a compelling reason to do two heads, not just, for a different expression. So, Merman, he was a character that definitely had a big justification. Because when you looked at the vintage card back, that was not the head that we got on the vintage figure. And this was one of those things that for years fans had wanted. And it was kind of one of those promises that people hoped would happen. Looking at that card art for the vintage figure, or as I prefer, Nate's version of it, which I think is really awesome. Go Nate, you're a great artist. That head was, it was not what showed up on shelf when we were kids, and it was noticeable because you could flip it around and really look at that and say, wait a minute, that's like not the head that was on the cross-sell, and it kind of wasn't as cool as the head on the cross-sell. Heck, even the Filmation animated series had a way cooler head on Merman than you got on the figure at shelf. So, yeah, this was definitely one of those kind of like long promises that one day a Merman would emerge that would have this head. And a big reason I hypothesize for this is because of the Kirby influence. If you check out the video on this channel about the sort of the secret Jack Kirby connection to MOTUC, he drew a lot of fishy characters and with like gills coming out of their heads, and that was a huge influence on the MOTUC line because of the sort of the nixed New Gods line that never happened. You can definitely check out the video, but the long story short is Mattel designers had spent years looking at a New Gods line and looking at that art as influence for a figure line, and then when that didn't happen, you can definitely see the influence in what became MOTUC when energies went into that instead of doing a licensed brand. So fans weren't the only ones. Eric Treadwell from the Four Horsemen was also somebody who just loved Merman and felt so disappointed that that original head didn't happen, and he was determined to get this head out on the figure. And that kind of, that basically is, overdue versus overdue. That was kind of a big theme of Merman because we finally got that head out, which was overdue, but this was, the Horsemen were also ones to really, what I would call over-sculpt. This kind of happened throughout the line until we, kind of got the reins on it, where the Horsemen were, really creative geniuses, and they were always coming up with more and more stuff they wanted to put on the figures. And we couldn't always afford that. And I do remember in particular, Eric, in addition to the head, he wanted to give Merman all these like kind of little buddies to like little fish mermaid buddies to swim around with him. Probably not looking like this. Probably looking a lot more like this. But again, that was just a bridge too far, and from a tooling budget, we could not afford to give him a bunch of little angry fish friends. So that would have been cool. So yeah, we basically had to start giving them an exact ingredient after that, telling them kind of exactly what to sculpt, because otherwise they would have just kept sculpting and sculpting and sculpting. But Merman did get a really cool neck piece that I think really makes the figure. It just basically slipped over the regular neck, but it gave him a lot of personality, and it made him look a lot different than the regular figures. He also got these really cool webbed fingers, or webbed hands, that wound up getting reused a few times in the line. I think Optic had them, if I want to say right. But yeah, that was another kind of new part to add to our tooling bank. And this was great because we were starting to get more and more parts that could be shared. So yeah, I mean, he came out really great. That neck piece, the armor, the colors. He had 2 accessories. He had 2 heads, so he could be scaled back for that eventual movie year retail release that never happened, but we kind of always hoped would. And the bios continued, and the bio controversies continued. So here he was, Squiddish Rex. Where in the world did that name come from? That's his real name? That sounds terrible. Well, the rationale for Merman's real name was the idea, well, he said in the 2000X series that he had basically an uncle, and that he referred to that uncle as Uncle Squiddy. So the idea was, well, if you have an Uncle Squiddy, if that's, the type of name that Merman's people have, then, Squiddish sounds kind of right, and Rex being, Latin for king, and there was always a lot of Latin in the Motu line. So that's kind of where his real name came from, because obviously his mom didn't name him Merman. And that's kind of Merman. He was a figure that was a promise kept. We got that head out, and he was the first character not, from that original rollout, other than the repaint of Faker, but he was the first, tooled and sculpted figure that showed the line had a really robust future ahead of it. We were really excited. This was definitely a time.